You guys hear me? Yep. My head is too small to fit through, maybe my best. I'm just going to project because I don't need this, and this is going to fall on my face. All right. So, my name is DiCo, and I have been teaching high school for the last 10 years. Although teaching is perhaps a strong word to describe those early years, I remember this one time when a kid spent the entire period throwing poker chips at my head. And who can forget that time that I didn't notice when a kid got up during my class, walked to another boy, and stapled his arm. I just yearned for the day when my classroom management skills would be so exemplar that I could give a test without everyone talking. I hesitate to tell these stories, though, because it probably sounds like I'm complaining about the kids. If you can't control the classroom, kids are more likely to act out. Because if you can't protect yourself, how on earth are you supposed to protect them? Kids deserve excellent teachers, and back then, God knows I wasn't one. Over time, thankfully, things got a little better, and I, last year, was awarded Teach for America's Alumni Award for Excellence in Teaching. And just this year, my charter school network, Achievement First, named me a master teacher, which is its highest level of distinction. But if there's one thing I have learned in these 10 years, it's actually not about me, but it's about my students. And how did I go from being a teacher that felt like teaching class 801 6th period was doing penance for my sins, to being perhaps the only teacher in the country that gets bummed out on snow days? I would say it has to do with purpose. Viktor Frankl once wrote that he who has a why can endure almost any how. And for me, my why was helping kids find their voice in speech and debate. Now, speech and debate was nothing new to me. I went to a pretty good high school and a not too shabby college, but I always say that it was those mornings, dressing up in suits, giving speeches to strangers, that I got my real education. You see, for me, yes, I was a state finalist and a national finalist by the time I graduated, but what really mattered was that I had the opportunity to speak my truth about what I perceived as a very broken world. During my junior year of high school, I watched the Twin Towers burn from 3 blocks away. And when I evacuated with my teachers and my friends, I had to talk about it. And I carved out a space for myself to talk about it at speech and debate tournaments. It didn't matter what the prompt was. That judge was sitting there listening to me, and they were going to hear me talk about what happened. Now, to be fair, I didn't know how to make sense of what had happened, but I did know that I had experienced something that they didn't, and so it was my job to persuade them that it mattered. And speech and debate over time has transformed its meaning for me. Because it's not so much about persuading the judges that it matters. It's not so much about my voice, but amplifying the voices of others. You see, for the last 10 years, I have been coaching high school speech and debate in New York City. And what I have learned in that time as a speech and debate coach is that just like I had experienced something terrible, a lot of my students unfortunately do too. And I felt crazy in high school when it seemed like nobody else was talking about September 11th, and even here at Yale. And so when I became a teacher, I made a promise that when bad things happen in my students' lives, I would not stay silent. There were two problems. So first of all, I had experienced one trauma, but my students, as people of color living in America, have experienced a countless number. Samuel L. Jackson once said, "People know about the Klan and the overt racism, but it's the killing of one's soul little by little and day by day that is a lot worse." And after teaching black and brown students for 10 years, I'm beginning to understand what Samuel L. Jackson must have meant. Because speech and debate tournaments, like so much of our country, are predominantly white spaces, where my students, at best, feel underrepresented, and at worst, feel unwelcome. This year, I had a student come up to me after a round, crying because during the round, someone had told her that her grandma, who was from Yemen, must be a terrorist. This year, I had a student tell me she started crying during her speech because she was sitting in front of her 12th white judge of the day, and she was literally the only black woman she had seen at the tournament. I sat next to a Latina student at a national final round, and as we watched white boy after white boy after white boy walk across the stage, she turned to me and earnestly asked, "Do I belong in this room?" And you know, I wonder, if she were here right now, would she ask the same question? Because Yale, speech and debate, our country, is a place where, like I said, at best, my students feel underrepresented, and at worst, frankly feel unwelcome. So yes, I wanted to be that teacher that would not be silent when bad things happen in my kids' lives. But when micro and sometimes macro aggressions happened at every single tournament, how could I pull that off? And even if somehow, I could address every single incident that happened, I'd face another problem. I didn't know what to say. So they teach you a lot in educational methodology classes. But they don't cover what to do when kids, for instance, throw poker chips at your heads. And they also don't cover what to do when kids start crying. So I didn't know what to say when one of my students broke down while she was talking about her immigration speech. And as a way to try to understand where she was coming from, I gently prodded, do you have a cousin or an uncle who's been deported? And she turned to me and simply said, "Actually, it was my dad." I didn't know what to say when a mom on the team called me to say that something was terribly wrong, but she was afraid to ask for help because she was undocumented. And if something happened to me, would I promise to take care of her girls? I didn't know what to say when one of her daughters called me a few days later and said she couldn't make it to the tournament in Philadelphia that weekend. And when I asked, "Are you okay?" she said no. And when I asked, "Is your mom okay?" she said, "No, she's dead." I didn't know what to say the next morning when my entire team came in crying. I am a speech and debate coach. It is my job to know what to say, but I didn't know. Just like in high school, when I couldn't make sense of tragedy, I also just couldn't sit there and be silent. You know, I learned how to speak well in high school, but it turns out I had yet to learn how to speak up. It turns out that the most important speeches I would ever give would come years after my last tournament. They wouldn't be for judges, and they wouldn't be for trophies. but they would still be about persuading the person in front of me that something mattered. In this case, they themselves. And it turns out that the best people to teach me about speaking up were my own students. Because on that morning, when my team came to me in tears, I didn't know what to say, but Papo did. And he stood up as a junior and made the call. We are going to Philadelphia, we are going to do well, and we are doing this for them. And my kids aren't just courageous when they talk to each other, but they are courageous every time they step foot in a speech and debate tournament. Think about it for a second. If you had 10 minutes where you could speak your truth and no one could interrupt you, what would you talk about? Sure, my kids could talk about something entertaining, or something funny, or something cute, or something safe. But instead, they often use their platform to push people. This year, our speeches included topics that address the silencing of women, that address the rape crisis on college campuses, that address the unchecked police brutality against people of color in America. And let me tell you, people did not always like to be pushed. Because my kids have gotten feedback on ballots that said things like, well, my family came here legally, how come yours couldn't? Or, oh, you're Latina? I couldn't tell, you looked normal. And if the judges' words wasn't message enough, the choices they made at tournaments certainly was. Perhaps the most striking example was Emory this year. So it was 1 week after Trump's inauguration. And my team captain, daughter of undocumented Mexican immigrants, was delivering a speech about the racial implicit bias towards whiteness in America and its devastating impacts. And what's incredible is that she got to semifinals and was top 12 in the country. But what's also incredible is the reason why she didn't make top 6. Because the judges picked over her a white girl whose message was that speech and debate has no place for personal stories. She explicitly named in her speech that it wasn't fair when people talked about their personal struggles because she didn't have any, and the judges shouldn't hold that against her. You laugh, but this woman got to the final round at Emory, and my students and I watched her in finals compete against a black man who stood up and talked about our need for more empathy and grounded it in his own experience with sexual assault. We watched her compete against a Sikh man who talked about how his entire life he has been harassed because of the turban that he wears on his head. We watched her stand up and essentially demand that those men sit down. Because when you are used to privilege, equality feels like oppression. But like those students in that final round, my kids were unafraid and undeterred. And we need to be too. Even when judges or institutions try to silence us. Even when family members or friends try to antagonize us. And even when the voices of self-doubt that echo in our heads cripple us. My students need to inspire all of us to speak courageously. You see, they take a risk just by breathing every day as people of color in America. Last month, one of my students published an op-ed in the Huffington Post titled, "My mom is undocumented, my dad was deported, and I am the resistance." She took a risk by drawing attention to her family and to her undocumented mother in order to speak her truth. What risks are we taking? Muhammad Ali once said that he who is not courageous enough to take risks will accomplish nothing in life. And my friends, there is so much that we have to accomplish. As for my team and their accomplishments, this year we sent 16 kids to the New York State Championship. We sent 3 kids to the National Championship. And we had a kid advance to elimination rounds at every single national tournament we competed in, from Princeton to Columbia to Emory to UPenn to Harvard, and of course, to Yale. If my kids could do that, what can we do? If they can take those risks, what risks can you take? You see, I know that a lot has happened in the last 10 years since we graduated. But what happens in the next 10 depends on how we use our choices and also how we use our voices. And next year, I am proud to say that my team captain, the daughter of undocumented Mexican immigrants, will be adding her voice to the seminar tables and the lecture halls here at Yale. And as alumni and as allies, it is our responsibility to speak up so that we make the path easier for her and for all that follow her. Choose not to be silent. Choose not to be scared. Choose to speak up. Thank you.